Mahalo, Roger. I appreciate your welcome. Mai ka puka ana ka lā ma kumukahi a hiki aku I ka nalo o lehua. A loa aku I nā lihi a pau o kahiki. Ke aloha nui mai kākou. My name is Aolani Kailihou. I am from Mānoa, Oʻahu. I'm currently living here in Puna, Hawaii, where I work as an ʻŌiwi research and design consultant for Hālau Kupukupu at Kamehameha Schools, Hawaii. I am excited and privileged to be your moderator today. Before we get started, I just wanted to welcome each of you and thank you for being here today for our session. Today, we will be talking with author Emalani Case, whose new publication, Everything Ancient Was Once New, Indigenous Persistence from Hawaii to Kahiki is the topic of our session today. I wanted to just briefly introduce Emma, and then I'm going to hand it over to her to maybe tell us a little bit more about herself. Emma is actually in Kahiki right now, joining us from Aotearoa, where she lives and works as a lecturer in Pacific Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. She is a passionate writer, a passionate teacher, an active member of our Lahui, and a determined and astute scholar. It's a privilege to be here with you today, Emma. And I'm wondering if I'm going to hand it over to you so you can tell us a little bit more about yourself personally, and then maybe even tell us about what the inspiration of your book is and your journey, maybe from inspiration to actually book.
Ke aloha nui a kākou. It's such an honor to be here in this virtual space. I was just sharing earlier before we started that I've been in Kahiki, I've been away from Hawaii for a while, and though I wish we were meeting in person, the online format has allowed me to come home to Hawaii even while I have to be away. So I wanted to say thank you to Hawaii Book and Music, to the Hawaii Book and Music Festival, to the organizers for the invitation and the opportunity. And also a huge mahalo, if I forget to do this later, to my dear friend Aolani Kailihou for agreeing to moderate. When I was asked to pick a moderator, I thought, who do I want to sit and have a really good talk story with? And I thought, let's ask Aolani. So thank you so much for being here. Yeah, I'm happy to introduce myself a little bit further. So my name is Emalani Case, and I'm from Waimea on the Big Island, born and raised there. And I think that's really important to mention because who I am and what I am is very much a reflection of where I'm from and who I'm from. And so I can't go without acknowledging Waimea and acknowledging my family and my ohana there. I think my mom's on, so hi mom. Yeah, and you know, anybody who knew me growing up knew that I was very much a homebody. So the fact that I am not living in Hawaii right now is kind of remarkable. I never, even when I went to Hilo to study for my bachelor's degree, I didn't move from Waimea. I drove every day because I love being at home that much. But when I went on to get a master's degree, I moved to Oʻahu. I went to Mānoa. I moved a little bit away from Waimea, and for a Waimea girl, that's moving a long ways away. So I moved to Oʻahu. And then when I decided to get a PhD, I wanted to pursue Pacific Studies, and there is no PhD program in Pacific Studies in Hawaii. And so I thought, okay, you've got to make a big move if this is what you want to pursue. And so I ended up moving here in 2012 to Aotearoa. I currently live in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, also known as Wellington, and I have to acknowledge that I live on the land of Te Atiawa. I'm an Indigenous person currently living on land that I'm not Indigenous to, and that reality and that positionality has definitely fed my research over the last so many years since I've been here. And why I mention all of this is because that physical journey to Aotearoa was my journey to Kahiki. And I keep using that term Kahiki, and I'll briefly explain it because it really is the inspiration for this work. So Kahiki is where we say we came from. Before our ancestors migrated to Hawaii, they came from Kahiki. Kahiki may at one point have been Tahiti. It may have been a physical place, a specific place that you can locate on a map. But as other scholars like Kealani Cook and David Chang talk about, Kahiki evolved over time and eventually became this term used to refer to the knowing that we came from somewhere else in the Pacific. So Kahiki is our ancestral homeland. It's not necessarily one specific place on the map, but it's the ancestral memory of having migrated. Of course, over time, as I talk about in the book, Kahiki did evolve to be used in different circumstances. So the inspiration really for exploring Kahiki came from being in Kahiki, came from being in a place outside of Hawaii. As Hawaiians started to interact with foreigners from other places outside of Hawaii and outside of the Pacific, they used Kahiki to explain where these foreigners came from. So Kahiki eventually became a term that you could use to refer to any place outside of Hawaii. And so in coming to Aotearoa, I left Hawaii and came to a Kahiki. I came to a place beyond my home and my homeland. And it was that physical journey that actually inspired me to explore Kahiki in my PhD work. And the reason I share all of that is because the basis of this book, at the foundation of this book, or the foundation of this book is my PhD work, exploring Kahiki. But to kind of talk about the journey of this specific book, I have to be honest that this isn't my PhD dissertation. This isn't what we call in Aotearoa a PhD thesis. I initially submitted my PhD thesis or dissertation to be considered for publication. It was accepted by UH Press, and it was reviewed by reviewers and the editors. I have to acknowledge the editors of Indigenous Pacifics, which is the series that this book was published under. That's Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua and April Henderson. So the editors and the reviewers read the manuscript, which really was my PhD thesis, and they gave me a lot of constructive feedback that pushed me and challenged me. And though they probably didn't realize it at the time, they pushed me to basically rewrite it. So I took my PhD thesis, I took heaps of content out of it and I rewrote it. And that became this book. At the core is Kahiki, but my mission in writing this book was really to bring Kahiki out of the past and bring it into the present. My PhD did a lot to try to understand what Kahiki was in the past, in different points in history. And this book was my attempt to understand what Kahiki can be now. I took inspiration and I feel like I got permission from our kupuna who were always toying with Kahiki and playing with it and using it to explain their changing circumstances to themselves. And I thought if they were doing that, it's our responsibility to continue to do that today, to continue to use Kahiki and see how Kahiki can speak to our protective actions or our actions to protect Mauna Kea, to see how it can speak to climate change, to see how it can speak to trans-Indigenous or trans-Pacific solidarities. What can Kahiki offer our movements now? That's what I wanted to do with this book. So, in revising it, I realized it would perhaps be a disservice to Kahiki to publish my PhD thesis as it was. I needed to actually do what I was advocating we do with Kahiki, and that was bring it into the now and continue to give it new life so that it can continue to be ancient for future generations. So yeah, that's just a little bit. It comes out of my PhD thesis, yes, but this isn't my PhD. It's something actually completely new. Because I think Kahiki challenged me to make it new.
No, I think that you reinforced the reason why we need to, as much of a struggle as it can be to find contemporary relevance, sometimes it's a struggle. Sometimes it's a struggle to find the license or to give yourself the license to do that. So I think you touched on that. I want to talk about, we have a question from Hi'ile Hobart. So I'm going to read that. And it actually leads, interesting enough, it leads into the next question I had as well, which is really your work as a teacher. And so Hi'ile asks, she says, mahalo for your work, Dr. Case. I've had the pleasure of reading your book cover to cover. I would love to hear more about how you use this work to envision trans-Pacific solidarities. How do your students in Aotearoa engage with, think about, or even take inspiration from Kahiki as you discuss it with them?
Oh, mahalo, aloha e Hi'ile.
Great question.
Yeah, excellent question. In the book, I reflect a lot on being a teacher. I often tell my students, you know, I know I'm hired to be a teacher, but I'm a student in every classroom and I'm a student of them. And so it really is a privilege to be a teacher and to be in spaces with students. And here in Aotearoa, I have the privilege of being able to learn with the majority of my students are of Pacific heritage. I'm one of few Hawaiians that I know of in Te Whanganui Atara. And so I'm teaching students that I want to be in active solidarity with. And so to get to your question, how you use this work to envision trans-Pacific solidarities, I think Kahiki for me, as I've explained it to people, is my way of always acknowledging whakapapa connections or mo'oku auhau connections, genealogical connections. We know we are connected as Pacific peoples, but we don't always know, and we're not always practiced in acting upon those connections. Sometimes I think we lean too much on those connections and make ourselves feel too comfortable. I've seen it a lot in this country. As Pacific people, I've heard some Pacific people say things like, you know, I'm indigenous to the region, so I have a place here. I have a place in this country. And that denies the reality of settler colonialism, ongoing settler colonialism in this country. And if we lean too much to make on our genealogical connections to make us feel comfortable, then we're not doing enough to stand in active solidarity with tangata whenua, with the indigenous people here who are still struggling for sovereignty. You know, so when I teach Pacific students, and here in Aotearoa, there's a big distinction between Pacific and Maori. Maori are the indigenous people. Pacific people are, yes, related through genealogy, but came from other places in the region and now live here. And I always tell my students, there is a world of difference between seeing this whenua, this land, as the New Zealand nation state, and seeing this land as Aotearoa, the land of our Pacific relatives. If your relationships are first and foremost with the New Zealand nation state, then you're going to be responsible to the state, and you're not going to think first about your relationships to tangata whenua. So something that I do with all my students is I talk about positionality. Positionality is key. We have to always understand ourselves in relation first and foremost to tangata whenua, to the indigenous people here, and to the whenua, to the actual land that we're standing upon. When I said earlier that I'm an indigenous person living on indigenous land, living on land that I'm not indigenous to, I'm always really upfront about that, because I think that's important, because I think that holds me accountable to the places that I'm in. So I think in my own life, living here and working here with, you know, and the majority of my students are actually indigenous to this place, has given me the opportunity to really talk about indigeneity and obligations to place and people, depending on where we are. But to also get back to your question, and I know Aolani was going to talk about this as well, Kahiki has really helped me to extend and expand a sense of aloha ʻāina. And so aloha ʻāina in Hawaii is, you know, it's about loving aloha, love, ʻāina, land, loving place, loving all of our sources of sustenance, loving everything that feeds. But I often describe it as a fierce love. It's a ferocious love. It is a love that makes you do whatever possible to protect your place. As my cousin Pua often says, it's kind of like the love that pushes you to be braver than you ever thought you could be, to stand with everything you have to protect your place. And so I think Kahiki reminds us of these connections that we have to the Pacific. And I think therefore prompts us to think about how we extend aloha ʻāina. Yes, it is important to really stand in active protection for the lands and the waters that feed us at home, but it is just as important to be better in our everyday interactions with the earth so that we can help protect the lands and the waters of the people that we are genealogically related to in the rest of the Pacific. For instance, think about climate change. I mean, climate change is affecting everyone, but the people who are most vulnerable right now are on the low-lying islands in the Pacific, places like the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati. I don't have to go to those places to be in active solidarity with them. In fact, I need to stay where I am, and I need to be better where I am. And aloha ʻāina teaches me that, and Kahiki teaches me that. Kahiki is, again, the reminder that, yes, we are related to the people we have at home, but we are also obligated to this wider region. And so that's what I mean when I talk about how Kahiki is about holding us accountable and about constantly encouraging us to engage in active solidarity. that isn't about being comfortable, that isn't about going, hey, we're all one happy family, because we know that there are lots of ruptures and disconnections across the region. So it's about being real, about saying we know we're obligated to one another, we're accountable to one another. So what are we going to do about that? I'm going to hold my country accountable. I'm going to hold myself accountable here where I am to make sure that I'm living in a way that is for the betterment of all of us, if that makes sense. But those are the kinds of things that I talk about with my students. And sometimes my students have a really hard time connecting to place, especially my Pacific students who aren't from here. Their most, salient connections are to the homeland. So my Samoan students might be most connected to Samoa. Even if they've never been there, they view that as the homeland. And so sometimes it takes giving them the opportunity to develop bonds with the places that they're in, to recognize how they're being fed by the places that they're in. One of my very first classes in my introductory Pacific Studies courses here, in one of those very first classes, we talk about all of the waterways under the city that we're currently studying in and working in. There are streams that are culverted, that are hidden under the city. And I tell my students stories of those streams, and we talk about them because I want them to realize how land had to be altered for us to be here. We might not be from here, but we have the responsibility to love it. And sometimes students aren't practiced or aren't given the opportunity to love a place. And I know it sounds cliche and kind of hippie-ish to be like, we need love, but we do need love. We need aloha, we need that fierce love. And if they haven't had the opportunity to develop those bonds with place, then I try to help them do that.
I was thinking about, like, when you were talking about, where you've written, revising, of course, like you were saying, and then being in Aotearoa when you wrote both your manuscripts, right? Because I think they're different enough to call them two different projects in some ways. Yeah? But who was the primary audience for your work? Like, when you think about your PhD, who were you writing to? And then when you rewrote the book, or not, I don't know if it's a rewrite, I don't know if that's the right word, but who's the primary audience of this?
That's a good question. When I was writing my PhD, I can remember very vividly sitting at a cafe with Teresia, drinking some coffee, and she was telling me about how my PhD thesis didn't sound like a PhD thesis. And she was like, but that's a good thing. And I remember distinctly her telling me, if you want to publish this as a book one day, don't write it as a PhD thesis. Don't write it as a dissertation. She said, because if we're being honest with ourselves, when people publish their dissertations as books, we usually skip over the methodology chapter or we read through it. She said, write it as if you're writing a book, and write it to people outside of academia. I remember her saying that. And when my PhD went through its examination process, one of the examiners said, oh, it doesn't sound like a PhD. And she was really excited about that. And so I took that as a big compliment, and that a sign that I had written it in a way that meant it wasn't so, it is academic, but it's not confined to academia, which was always my goal with the PhD. When I submitted the first manuscript, which was essentially the PhD, Noelani and April, the editors of Indigenous Pacifics, came back and said, we like it, but make it sound more like your blog. And so I have a little blog that's been a bit neglected lately, called He Wahi Pa'akai. And the cool thing about the blog is that when I started it, it was just because I felt like I had all these things to say that I just wanted to get out there, but I never worried about form, style. Yes, there are references on the blog, but some of it's poetic, some of it's deeply personal. And it was just like, I felt free in that kind of writing. And when Noelani and April said, make it sound more like your blog, I just thought, wow, they want more of me. They actually want me to be in it. And so when I rewrote it or started drafting this book, I made sure to make it more personal. This, I may have mentioned earlier, is much shorter than the PhD. I stripped things back. I took things out. I wanted it to be a book that anyone could pick up, that a student at university could pick up and find useful, that my family at home could pick up and find useful. I wanted it to be relevant in different contexts. I wanted it to speak to our activist movements, to our social justice movements, but I also wanted it to help us work through the ongoing legacies and violences of settler colonialism. I wanted it to speak to our realities. With that said, it's not above, it's not beyond critique. I read it now and go, ooh, some of these chapters are a little dense. You could have made that a little bit more readable in parts. So, you know, I've already started critiquing it, but my goal was really to make it broad enough and open enough for a wide audience. Yeah, so it's not confined to academia.
Yeah. Emma, mahalo for your answer. We have a question here. This is from Noah. He says, hi, Emma, you've talked a little bit about how we have a responsibility to Kahiki by how we behave here at home. Mm-hmm. I realize that there are many issues throughout the Pacific where our cousins need solidarity and support, but it feels like the linguistic and national barriers now between us make it difficult to even be aware of what is happening with them. Do you have any suggestions on how to build our own awareness of the Pacific? It's a good question.
That is a great question.
You talked a little bit about the barriers, like, but you know, I'm thinking about like, yeah, the barriers. I mean, even in algorithm, or yeah. Mahalo e noa. Yeah, there's a lot of barriers, and a lot of them are colonial barriers. The fact that we have linguistic barriers in the Pacific, you know, with the Sinophone Pacifics, the Hispanophone Pacific, the Anglophone Pacific, the Francophone Pacific, that's a result of colonialism, right? So we can't actually, even though sometimes we really want to speak to each other, we can't. And so what does that then mean for our solidarity? You know, how is our solidarity limited? And I think, you know, at least as a first step, and this isn't coming from me, this is coming from, you know, people who've been working in the region for a really long time. It's identifying the issues that really link all of us, that we are fighting as a region. Epeli Hau'ofa, for instance, said, you know, we've seen so much success when we've seen how the region is impacted by militarism and by nuclear testing. You know, that runs across linguistic barriers, where French Polynesia has been impacted, Hawaii's been impacted, the Marshall Islands have been impacted. That kind of violence knows no colonial boundary. It's gone across the region and it impacts all of us. And we've seen the most success as a region when we've acted as a region. And Epeli Hau'ofa was really, and he's an amazing Oceanian scholar. If you've never heard of him, I highly recommend looking up all his work. But he was really intentional in talking about a regionalism and a regional identity and how we need to be dedicated to the region. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to also hold on to our nationalism. We can be truly patriotic. I can be aloha ʻāina through and through, but I can also be a strong Pacific person dedicated to the region. And in fact, I think if we look at our issues today, we have to recognize how our issues, how the struggles and the problems that we face as Pacific peoples are interrelated. And I really recognized this last year when a lot of us, or a group of us, there was a core group of us back home and a group of us here who were trying to put an end to RIMPAC, the biennial Rim of the Pacific Maritime War exercises that happen in Hawaii every other year. And I remember at the time where we were really doing a lot of online activism against RIMPAC, you know, the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd was murdered and the Black Lives Matter movement really exploded and reemerged. And I remember at the time I kept going with talking about RIMPAC, and people would be like, well, you know, right now we need to focus on Black Lives Matter. And I was like, in a way though, my talking about RIMPAC is advocating for a better world for Black lives at the same time. You know, so we have to see the connections. We have to identify those connections. We have to point them out to people. And so I'm not trying to be like, good job, Emma, but a lot of my work just sort of ended up being in 2020, revealing some of those connections. That me calling for an end to RIMPAC is not about that single event. It is about the structures that underpin them and make it possible. The structures of militarism that lead to the ongoing militarization of our police forces, that lead to police violence at home in Hawaii, here in Aotearoa, where police forces are increasingly Americanized, in the, on the continental US, in West Papua as well, where Indonesian soldiers routinely go to Hawaii and train in RIMPAC. It's about looking at the way that our homeland in Hawaii has become a training ground for violence around the region. So it was about revealing some of those interconnections to show that our issues are not isolated, they are like this. Colonialism and militarism and white supremacy thrive by the myth of separateness. So once we bring all of those issues together and show our fellow islanders in the Pacific that despite linguistic barriers, despite colonial barriers, our fates are intertwined and we fight together. We may not be able to always understand each other, but we understand the pain of colonialism,
of imperialism, of ongoing racism and ongoing violence in our region. And that, if anything, is going to keep bringing us together.